The air inside the prison was thick with the stench of sweat, rust, and despair. Steel bars clanged shut behind Leon Carter as he stepped into a world where innocence was a forgotten word and survival was the only currency that mattered. Once a decorated Delta Force commander, Leon now wore the drab gray of a convict, his broad shoulders stooped under the weight of a wrongful conviction. The guards' indifferent stares and the jeers of fellow inmates greeted him like a chorus of vultures circling a fresh kill. But beneath the surface, Leon was no broken man. He was a predator in a den of wolves, and he'd fight tooth and nail to claw his way back to the truth. Somewhere in this hellhole lurked the shadow of Elliot Foster, the puppet master who'd framed him, and Leon swore he'd drag that shadow into the light. This wasn't just a story of a man locked away. It was a saga of betrayal by the very nation he'd bled for, a relentless struggle against the savage underbelly of prison life, and a burning quest for justice. Leon's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the yard, taking in every threat, every flicker of movement. He wasn't here to rot. He was here to survive, to uncover the conspiracy that had stripped him of his freedom, and to reclaim what was his. Outside those towering walls, Jessica, his steadfast ally, fought her own battle to prove his innocence. Together, they were a fractured beacon of hope in a darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. The whispers started the moment Leon crossed the threshold of Cell Block C. "Fresh meat," they sneered, mistaking his quiet demeanor for weakness. They couldn't have been more wrong. Leon Carter wasn't just any prisoner. He was a former Delta Force commander, a man who'd led elite squads through firefights in deserts and jungles, who'd stared death in the face and walked away unbroken. But here, stripped of his rank and honor, he was nothing more than a number. 47291. The irony gnawed at him. He'd spent his life defending a country that had now turned its back on him, pinning a crime he didn't commit. A fabricated murder charge that landed him in this concrete abyss. Jessica, his lifeline beyond the bars, refused to let the lie stand. A fierce investigative journalist with a fire in her soul, she'd been by his side since their childhood days in Chicago. She knew the real Leon, the man who'd carried wounded comrades to safety, who'd never been to corruption. Now, she scoured records, chased leads, and hounded officials, determined to unearth the evidence that would set him free. Her letters slipped through the prison mail like rays of sunlight, each one a reminder that he wasn't alone. "I'm close, Leon," she wrote in her latest note. "Hang on. We'll get you out." Her words were his anchor, tethering him to a world beyond the razor wire. Inside, though, survival demanded more than hope. The Iron Fangs, a ruthless prison gang, ruled the yard with fists and shivs, their leader Blaze a hulking figure with a scar snaking down his cheek. Leon felt their eyes on him from day one, predators sizing up prey. He knew their kind, power-hungry, relentless, thriving on fear. They didn't scare him. He'd faced worse in the field. But this wasn't a battlefield with clear lines and orders. This was a jungle of chaos, and he'd have to adapt or die. The prison was a crucible, forging men into either survivors or ghosts. Leon learned that fast. Every day tested his resolve, taunts echoing down the cell block, trays slammed into his back in the mess hall, shadowed figures lurking in corners. Blaze was the ringleader, his gravelly voice cutting through the din. "You think you're tough, soldier boy?" He'd sneer, his gang snickering behind him. Leon met his gaze with steel, refusing to flinch. "I don't think," he replied coolly. "I know." The words hung heavy, a quiet defiance that stoked Blaze's rage. The tension wasn't just words. It was a simmering volcano, ready to erupt. Leon understood the stakes. In here, strength wasn't optional. It was life itself. He'd trained his body and mind for war, and those skills became his shield. Push-ups in his cell at dawn, shadowboxing in the dim light, Every move honed his edge. The prison wasn't just a cage. It was a proving ground, a relentless war of attrition where hesitation meant death. He memorized the routines, the guards' shifts, the gang's patterns. Knowledge was power, and he wielded it like a blade. Then came the first ambush. Under the flickering lights of the shower block, Iron Fangs struck. 3 of them, fists flying, a shiv glinting in the steam. Leon's instincts kicked in, muscle memory from years of combat guiding his every dodge and strike. He took down the first with a swift elbow to the jaw, sent the second sprawling with a knee to the gut. The third lunged with the blade, but Leon twisted his wrist, sending the weapon clattering to the tiles. Blood dripped from a gash on his arm, but he stood tall as they retreated, their bravado shattered. Word spread fast. The new guy wasn't prey. He was a force. Fear gnawed at Leon, though he'd never admit it. Not fear of the fangs or their blades, but of a deeper kind. The dread of fading into oblivion, of never clearing his name. The jeers of murderer from inmates stung worse than any punch, a constant reminder of the lie that defined him here. Nights were the hardest, the silence amplifying his thoughts. He'd lie on his bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling, haunted by what-ifs. What if Jessica couldn't find the proof? What if he didn't make it out alive? The weight pressed on his chest, threatening to crush the fire within. Memories kept him grounded. His mother's voice, soft and steady, telling him to stand tall no matter what. The laughter of his old squad, brothers he'd fought beside. Those moments fueled him, a lifeline to the man he'd been before this nightmare. He wasn't just surviving for himself, he was fighting for them, for the honor they'd believed in. Jessica's updates fueled that resolve. "I've got a lead on Foster," she wrote once, her words sparking a flicker of hope. "He's dirty, Leon. We'll nail him." That name, Elliot Foster, burned in his mind, a faceless enemy he'd yet to meet but already despised. Her faith in him was a lifeline, but it came with pressure. She saw the warrior he'd been, not the battered man he felt like now. "You're stronger than this place," she insisted in a rare phone call, her voice crackling through the static. "You always have been." He clung to that, letting it steel his spine against the daily grind of threats and violence. He wouldn't let her down, or himself. The yard buzzed with tension as Leon prepared for war. The Iron Fangs weren't done with him. Blaze's bruised ego demanded retribution. Leon knew a showdown was inevitable, and he wouldn't wait to be cornered. In his cell, he crafted a weapon from the mundane, a toothbrush, its handle sharpened against the concrete floor into a jagged point. It wasn't much, but in his hands, it was lethal. This wasn't about bravado, it was about sending a message he wouldn't be broken. Mac, a wiry inmate with a knack for survival, watched him work. "You're crazy, Carter," he muttered, leaning against the bars. "Blaze'll gut you for this." Leon didn't look up. "Not if I gut him first." Mac chuckled, a rare sound in this bleak place. "You got guts, I'll give you that, but guts ain't enough. You need a plan." Leon nodded. "I've got one." It wasn't just about fighting, it was about outsmarting. Blaze relied on brute force. Leon would use strategy, the kind he'd mastered in covert ops. The confrontation came in the yard, under a sky heavy with gray clouds. The Fangs closed in, their boots scuffing the dirt. Blaze's smirk a mask of menace. "End of the line, soldier," he growled. Leon gripped his makeshift shiv, muscles coiled. "Not yet." The air stilled, every eye locked on them. Then chaos erupted. Blaze charged, fists swinging, his crew fanning out. Leon ducked, struck, and weaved, the toothbrush finding flesh with surgical precision. Blood sprayed, shouts rang out, and for a moment he was back in the field, a warrior unleashed. The fight ended with Franklin Jones, a grizzled guard with a limp, barking orders. "Enough!" His baton slammed against a railing, scattering the Fangs like roaches. Blaze spat blood, glaring as he was dragged off. Franklin's eyes met Leon's, a flicker of something, respect, passing between them. "You're trouble, Carter," he said gruffly, "but you're still breathing." It wasn't friendship, but it was a lifeline. Franklin's intervention shifted the tide, a crack in the prison's brutal order. Leon slumped against the wall, bruises blooming across his ribs. He'd won, but at a cost. Exhaustion clawed at him, doubt whispering in the quiet. Then he thought of his past, of dragging a wounded teammate through a hail of bullets, refusing to leave a man behind. That was who he was. He wouldn't quit now. Franklin's presence lingered in his mind, a potential ally or at least a neutral force. In this pit, that was gold. Jessica's next letter brought fire. "Foster's name keeps popping up," she wrote. "He's connected to your case. Deep. I'm digging." It was fuel, stoking the ember of purpose in his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was hunting. Defense wasn't enough. Leon knew it as the fangs regrouped, their whispers growing bolder. He needed to strike back, to shift the balance. Jessica's encouragement echoed in his head. "You're a fighter, Leon. Fight." He took it to heart, scanning the yard for allies. Ramon, a quiet giant with a shaved head and a tattooed arm, caught his eye. Word was, Ramon had his own beef with Blaze. Leon approached him during rec time, voice low. "We've got a common problem. Help me, and I'll watch your back." Ramon studied him, then nodded. Deal. Their pact was tested soon after. The fangs ambushed again, this time in the mess hall. Trays crashed, fists flew, and Leon and Ramon fought side by side. Ramon's raw power complemented Leon's precision, a brutal ballet of resistance. They held their ground, bloodied but unbowed, the gang retreating under their combined fury. It was a victory, small but seismic. Leon wasn't alone anymore. The final clash with Blaze was inevitable. Leon's defiance had made him a target, but also a symbol. He'd worn Blaze down, physically, mentally, and the yard became their arena. The fight was savage, a blur of blows and grunts, Leon's toothbrush shivs slashing through the chaos. Ramon's timely tackle of a fang minion tipped the scales. Blaze fell, battered and broken, his arrogance bleeding out with every gasp. "Who's behind it?" Leon snarled, pressing the shiv's tip to Blaze's throat. "Foster," Blaze rasped, eyes wild. "Elliot Foster." The name hit like a grenade. Leon stepped back, chest heaving. The pieces clicked. Foster, the unseen hand, the architect of his ruin. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Freedom came after months of blood and grit. Jessica's relentless digging, paired with Franklin's quiet aid, cracked the case wide open. Foster's web unraveled. Haven Enterprises, a front for laundering and bribes linked to crooked cops and lawyers. Leon walked out of those gates a free man, but the fight wasn't done. Foster still breathed, his empire intact. Jessica met him at the gate, her embrace fierce. "We've got him on the ropes," she said. "But he's slippery." Leon's jaw tightened. Not for long. He'd uncovered Foster's sins. A man who'd crushed communities, who'd framed Leon for exposing his corruption years ago. Now, it was personal, and bigger than revenge. Leon vowed to dismantle Foster's world, to protect others from the same fate. Their hunt took them deep into Foster's lair, a gleaming high-rise hiding a cesspool of crime. Garrett Lang, a turncoat in Foster's ranks, fed them intel, meeting schedules, security layouts. Leon planned the strike with military precision, infiltrating under cover of night. The confrontation was electric. Foster's smug grin faltered as Leon laid out the evidence, recordings, ledgers, proof of his rot. "You're done," Leon said, voice cold as steel. Foster's empire crumbled as sirens wailed, justice closing in. Foster's conviction, conspiracy, bribery, murder, was a triumph. Leon stood in the courtroom, unbowed as the gavel fell. The man who'd caged him was now the prisoner. Jessica squeezed his hand, a silent promise of new beginnings. They walked into the sunlight, free at last. But Leon's mission wasn't over. He'd fight for the forgotten, the framed, the broken, because he'd been them. His war had forged a purpose, and he'd carry it forward, a warrior reborn,